Hey, this is Professor Game, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who bring us the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting our students to learn what we teach. And I am Rob Alvarez. I'm the founder of Professor Game and professor of gamification and games-based solutions at IE Business School, EFMD, EBS University, and many other places around the world. And if this content is for you, then please go ahead and subscribe to our email list for free at professorgame.com/subscribe. Hey, engagers, and welcome to another episode of the Professor Game podcast. And today we have Lauran with us. But Lauran, we need to know before we start, are you prepared to engage?
Of course.
Let's do this because we have Lauran Kerr-Heraly. Did I kind of say that okay?
It's Kerr-Heraly.
Kerr-Heraly. All right, I'll do my best if I have to say it again. And she's an award-winning educator and author. She right now serves as a history professor and innovation fellow at the Houston Community College, and her innovative teaching includes turning a classroom into an escape room, multidisciplinary projects showcasing personal food histories and environmental justice, and playing within experimental learning spaces. And as an executive function coach, she works with teens and their parents to develop a holistic approach to school success, which includes a focus on essential skills, executive function, and emotional awareness. She, of course, uses gamification in her coaching to motivate and engage, and she shares a nerdy and adventurous life with her husband and a 10-year-old in Houston, where they play a lot of board games. The more complicated, of course, the better. So, Lauran, are we missing anything from that intro?
That's great. Yeah, nice to be talking with you today.
Amazing. So, Lauran, we always like to get to know our guests a little bit more. So we always ask this question about, a regular day, regular week. What does living a life like yours look like? We want to be on your shoes for a bit.
All right. Well, I'm a community college professor. So I teach 2 days on campus, and then I teach classes online. And then the rest of the time I'm running around doing things like turning a classroom into an escape room. And I also have a coaching business where I help students and families with executive function skills. So that involves a lot of emails, Zoom calls, etc., helping people out and creating things as well. So in the evenings, we're definitely going to be playing some kind of board game. And I really enjoy doing that kind of thing. I have a 10-year-old, and my spouse is really big into games as well. We actually have a custom-built game table. So generally, the evening's going to end up with a game.
I have a question because I hadn't heard it before. What does that executive coaching that you mentioned, executive functions or something like that, can you expand a little bit on what does that mean?
Sure. So executive function is basically the brain's way. It's like command center, if you will.
Okay.
And it's the part of your brain that helps you get things done. So anything from time management to remembering things to emotional regulation to being able to follow through on tasks, things like that. So I've been teaching for over 20 years, and it's one thing that students really struggle with is they'll come to me and they'll say, well, I'm bad at time management. And I'm like, well, you're not totally bad at time management, but you might need some work on it. But they don't know that it's a function of the brain. And so when all you try to do is just sort of tackle the problem, you're not understanding the brain's processes, the mental processes that go behind it. You're not understanding the emotional roots of why you might be stuck on something. So I developed this program to help people with that. And people who are neurodivergent have perhaps heard this term more often. My spouse and my kiddo have ADHD. And so we speak this language a lot of people who have something like ADHD, that these things are harder to do for them. But there's always, ways to put structures in, to engage through, and that's, we do gamification in my own home with like chore lists and whatever else. So that make them more bearable and that make the brain say, oh, I want to do this, instead of the brain saying, oh, I hate all of that. I'm not going to even try. So that's executive function.
Amazing. Thank you for that explanation. And let's dive into a story, maybe of one of those times. But I want to make sure to clarify that this is not a story of success, at least not at the start. We want to be at the lowest of the low, that difficult moment when you're trying to do something and it just didn't work. Of course, then we'll get into the lessons or maybe how you got out of it and what you learned and how you do it differently today. But we certainly want to be there and understand, what went wrong and perhaps take some understanding and not to do it ourselves as well.
Sure. Well, so this escape room that I developed has taken 3 years to fully develop. And in the beginning, I was in a program called the Innovation Fellows here at my college, at Houston Community College. It's a program that faculty and staff can apply to, and you take a year kind of learning about innovation, learning about things like gamification and game-based learning, and developing projects. And so I had 2 ideas. One was to develop kind of a murder mystery game that was educational. And then I thought maybe there's liability issues with that. So I decided to go for the escape room. And when I started out, so I'll preface this by saying I rethink how I view failure now, where I would have seen this as like a total failure before. I now look back and see it as iterative, right? But at the time, what I wanted to do was make a permanent escape room in a classroom. I wanted to have a traveling kit that could go kind of around to campuses, because we have several campuses within my college system. And then I wanted to do an online version. Now, this was 2020, so online was my only option at the time.
Yeah.
So that's what I started with. But the failure part of this is actually the kit. So I had this great idea that I would put the kit, I would, essentially have all these objects like ciphers and puzzles and directions of different ways that professors could set this up in their own classrooms around our college system. And so I was going to put it through the library system so people could check it out like a book, and it would get delivered to their classroom and they could keep it for 2 weeks and essentially set it up for themselves. So it's 3 years later and I still don't have this kit in the system. I have a traveling kit, but I'm the only one that uses it because I could not figure out a way how to translate A, the instructions, and B, the scalability. So in other words, I teach history. So by default, the questions that I've put into the escape room are history-based. Now, if someone comes to me, like I've done this for chemistry, I've done this for HR, I've done this for a variety of people, but they come to me and say, here are the topics, can you put these into the escape room somehow? And I can do that if it's just me. But just simply sort of putting it into a box and saying, have fun, figure this out, did not work. So that is the failure part of it. And I've kind of accepted that at this point. Where I think I would do things differently is to, although I believe in like starting small and having a minimum viable product and all of that, I think what I would do differently next time is to actually make sure that the game worked on its own before I tried to put it into a kit and put it in the library system and all of that. So it needed more testing, but I also think the nature of it was difficult to explain to people. And we can talk about that later when we talk about people's sort of misbeliefs about gaming. But it was hard to explain to people what it was. Like I had a couple professors say, well, we're not legally allowed to lock our students in a room. And I said, no, I didn't. I never said that. It's like, I never said you had to actually, like, they don't have to actually physically escape. So those were the challenges of explaining what it was, helping people with scalability, etc.
That sounds amazing because, one of the things that, you were mentioning the whole scalability and especially when you mentioned the part of, I believe in this, but it has to be iterative. And I think it was, at least it sounds to me like it was certainly an iteration, what you were doing right there. And at this point, of course, maybe it sounds like, oh yeah, you moved on and you've done other things, but it doesn't mean that you can't pick it up later first. And then especially that there's nothing to do about it anymore. Like you can really still do a bunch of things with that. And, it is a lesson that we all get to learn. And as you mentioned at the start, now that's not necessarily a failure for you anymore. And there's a lot to learn from that. So I think overall, I do think that it was something that proved very, very useful for you, for your development and for understanding how these things work sometimes, right?
Absolutely.
Amazing. So And about the kit and the scalability, scalability can mean many different things, right? So how to do it. But one of the things that I did want to make sure I commented on this, and this is an argument that at least I use a lot on my workshops and so on. I always mention to people that gamification is more of a design discipline than anything else. So
Mm-hmm.
more often than not, when you try to look for something that works for everybody, that's where it gets hard, because not everybody's the same, not every class is going to be the same, not everything is going to work the same way, and that's okay. That's part of the way this works, and that's not a misdesign, so to speak. That's part of the way things are almost supposed to work.
Yeah, and that's a great point, because what did end up being successful was, like I said, if a particular professor or group, like I'm taking the anime club through the escape room next month. So what does work is for them to say, this is what we'd like to do. They're pretty open to the experience, but they just want it to be tailored a little bit to their, interest. So that I can do. And now, because I've worked on that slowly over time, I do have kind of a bank of different questions and different routes and different puzzles. And I actually had my students last semester, I took them into our makerspace and had them design like puzzle boxes and jigsaw puzzles and stuff that they put their own questions into. And so I've involved my students in the design process. So that has been successful, is to just say, okay, this is going to take a while, but over the course of a couple years, we're going to have, at this point, I think I've got about 10 different ways that the room can be set up and different disciplines that can use it. So the scalability does work, but you're so right that it is a game design issue. And if you try to it's not one size fits all. And it wouldn't
Yeah.
be effective if you try to make it fit everything.
And that's the way it is. Like, I mean, some people say, well, but it should work for everything. Look at other resources. Like, yeah, well, you can say that a book works for any subject, but not the same book. Has
Right.
its own author, right? You're not going to say that any PowerPoint is going to work for any class. PowerPoint works, but you have to build the PowerPoint. Part of the whole thing with
Mm-hmm.
PowerPoint is you have to put your work in it, and that's how it works, and that's fine. So again, thank you very much for sharing that experience. I think it is a very valuable lesson for some of us that it's easy to forget, right? It's easy to forget and get frustrated and say, well, I wanted for this to work for absolutely everybody, because we forget that this is that's almost by design. That's the way it works. So let's actually go for the opposite, or maybe it has to do with the same escape room that you're talking about. Maybe not. But let's go for a story of success, something that you're, one of those perhaps you could call proud stories, something that you want to say, well, I'd like to tell the engagers about this, essentially.
Yeah, well, I'll stick with the escape room for a little bit because I am super proud of that. And I'm also very lucky to work in a college that I can come to them with sort of crazy ideas. Like, can I have a classroom like forever and turn it into an escape room? And they're very supportive. So, some of the things I mentioned before, like getting students involved, having a team was really important, that I could involve other people in the design process. That I did a lot of testing in that classroom before I took students through it. I had my students test it as well and give me feedback. So don't underestimate the power of having a team, even if all they're doing is testing it for you. That's really valuable information. So that's a big success. Something else that I've done just on a small scale in my classroom, because I teach history, I do a lot of game-based stuff. And this is something that, most students respond well to, because they're interested in, their brains are interested in games. They play games, I teach 20 something. So I always ask them on the first day what their hobbies are, and video games is like number one, anime is number two, and then soccer. But so in the classroom, I've been able to play games on a lower level when it's simulations. And I'll preface that by saying there are some ethical considerations when you do a simulation. Like, you don't want a person to take on an ethnic identity that's not their own, for example. So there are ways to do it where you're not necessarily like putting yourself into someone's shoes, but you're creating a scenario that everyone can play along with, right?
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah. So because I used to do it the other way around, I was like, pretend you're a Native American in the 1840s. And then that just was very problematic and gross. And I was young and I've learned from it. But like, for example, PBS has a great site called Mission US, and they have various sort of missions that you do. Like the one my students did this week is from Crown or Colony, and they look at decisions that a 14-year-old apprentice would have to make in Boston as, the revolution is, coming very soon. Boston Massacre is happening, the Tea Party, etc. So, but I'm not asking them to become that person. I'm asking them to look at it from the perspective of that person. And there's a difference. And we do a debrief after to say, how did you view the history differently through the eyes of this person? What's the benefit of a simulation? What are the drawbacks of a simulation? Because a lot of them are really into video gaming, as I said, and sometimes that blurs the lines of reality. So I want to make sure that we have that debrief and say, this is a game. Yes, it's produced by an organization that I trust. It's peer reviewed. There were historians involved in it, but it's still a game, right? And so then I ask them to go and sort of cross-reference with their textbook and other research that they're working on. And that works really well because they're both enjoying the game and learning from it, but they're also investigating the limits and issues with it.
It's super interesting. One of the things, and I think there's a lot of cultural stuff involved in which I am definitely not an expert on. But when you were mentioning that, the assuming the identity it was problematic for you, I'm trying to remember who it was that was discussing how, for example, there was a live action RPG that they were doing somewhere because they wanted to help you understand how very old elderly people were feeling and what it was to be an elderly person and to live in one of these homes. And it was super, like what they did was super interesting, super educational, but you actually literally had to become that person, right? And I saw a documentary that took it a step further. Of course, there's a lot of more theatrics probably on this one. It has the actor of Thor, Chris Hemsworth, I think is his name. Mm-hmm. And they literally put on some devices so that he can feel how it's more difficult to move, and they blur his vision, and they put some headphones so he can hear worse. Like they literally turn him into an old person artificially, right? So I don't know. I just find it interesting that perhaps this has something to do with that it's cultural. I don't know, because this person that mentioned the live action RPG, I know they are from one of the Nordic countries in Europe, and I'm not sure if it's Denmark, Finland, which of those Nordic countries it is, but I know they did it there. And everybody was fine with it. And a bunch of people like left that simulation and started calling their grandparents, right? Because they felt that they needed some more love, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know, like it's interesting that for one, and I know that the cultural identity is like very, very, like works in let me call it a different way in the US. So I don't know. I just found it curious and wanted to make sure that for me, one of the key takeaways there is, whatever it is that you're doing, it is immersed within a culture or several cultures. So you need to understand what's appropriate and what's not. And that's really difficult. I mean, you learn the hard way as well, right?
Right. And I teach in a college in the US that we're the most ethnically diverse, and we have the most international students of any community college in the country. So, I in a class of 24, I've most likely got at least 20 different nationalities or ethnicities represented. Yeah. So I do listen to my students as well. And this is part of why I've changed some of the ways that I've done role play and simulations. For example, I do a simulation where, the American Civil War is coming, and the nation was very divided primarily on the issue of slavery. And so when I say half of you are going to represent the North and debate whether or not war is a good idea, like you want to vote for war, and half of you are going to represent the South. Now, no one wants to be the South. They don't want to be the bad guy that was fighting for slavery, right? So we have to say this is a simulation. Again, I'm not asking you to be this person and have these views, but I'm asking you to consider why someone would have these views. Because if we don't understand the why behind people's beliefs, even if
Yeah.
they are wrong or are different than ours, then we're not going to understand why things happen. And when you're speaking historically, cause and effect is really important, right? And it's a cliche, but we try to understand the past to understand the present, right?
It is definitely crucial. So let's move on to our next question because I really enjoyed that, but I also want to see if we get some more juice out of you, Lauran, because I know you have some interesting experiences under your coat. So, like, if I know you're constantly doing more stuff and using simulations and all that, what would be perhaps a process that you follow? Like, you're going to use game-based learning or you're going to use gamification. How would you introduce it? How you go through that decision-making process? What happens when you're thinking of these things? What goes through your mind, essentially?
Yeah. First of all, if I'm teaching something in my own class or if I'm working with my executive function coaching clients and I'm thinking, this is what I want them to learn, then I'm thinking, A, how can I make it fun? And B, how can I get there? So I always start with backwards design. So, in other words, I start with what I want them to learn. And in the classroom, that could be a simple objective like I want them to understand 4 causes of the American Revolution. With a coaching client, it might be something like I want to help them unlock the emotional reasons why they're procrastinating. I want them to unlock 3 reasons. So those are pretty broad, right? So what I decide then is I go backwards and I think, okay, this is what I want them to learn, these 3 causes of the revolution. And I'm going to go backwards and I'm going to say, how am I going to accomplish that? Like, how am I going to assess it? And then before that, I'm going to, and then like the step before that would be, what are the learning mechanisms? And then I go back to say, here's the background. So in other words, I start with what I want them to learn and then build the game or the lesson or whatever backwards. And sometimes that looks like building a pretty boring lesson or class and then gamifying it. Because sometimes that's what you have to do. And I do tell my students, I said, hopefully you'll have lots of fun in my class. And I tell my clients the same thing. But I also hope that sometimes you realize you have to do boring things. But I don't like doing boring things either. So that's why I gamify everything. So so backwards design is super helpful. And it's super helpful with addressing people's misbeliefs as well. Because with my escape room, for example, I had a hard time convincing people that this was actually worthwhile. It's what I use for my midterm. I don't give a midterm exam. I take my students through the escape room. And I joked that I say, if you all get out, then you get an A, because they're learning group dynamics, they're learning problem solving skills, and they're using their content knowledge to do it. So using backwards design and having really clear objectives helps address people's misbeliefs, because you're showing them this is for something. Because academics are funny about this. They're like, unless it's work, unless you're learning something, then it can't be worthwhile. If we can't assess
If it's
it
not
through a
hard
test,
and people don't want to do it, then we cannot do
right,
it.
right. So that's, so the backwards design and the lesson or the objectives are really important.
Amazing. Backwards design is sort of the foundation. There's plenty that you unpack there. So thank you for that, Lauran. And Lauran, with all this experience that you've had, of all the things that you've been doing, would you say that there's some sort of best practice, something that you would say, well, if you're going to work on gamification, do this, and at least it'll make your project a little bit better?
Yeah. Well, so I kind of had to learn the difference between game-based and gamification. Game-based is like, playing a game, a simulation, a board game, video game, whatever, even like a trivia game. Gamification is putting some rewards and badging and levels into what you're doing. So on a practical level, if I mentioned my 10-year-old who has ADHD, just saying you need to do all of these things today, and if you don't, there's a consequence, that's horrible for everyone, right? So instead, we have a small allowance that we give her for doing chores, and we said you have 4 checklists a day, and for each checklist you get 25 cents. that is very motivating. That's gamifying, right? Because she unlocks level 1, which is her morning checklist. She gets 25 cents. So she's automatically motivated to come home from school and do the afternoon checklist, which is going to get her another 25 cents. You know what I'm saying? And then the reward at the end of the week is that she gets to spend that $5 if she wants, or she can save it. It's usually she's saving it for Lego. And so that's an example of gamification. So when you're thinking about best practices, again, always start with like where you want to go, like what's your ultimate goal. And sometimes that can be something kind of emotional, like it's sort of vague to say, I want my clients and my students to learn empathy, right? But at the same time, how can I use game-based learning or gamification to teach them about empathy? Whether they learn it or not is kind of subjective, but I'm at least presenting an opportunity for them to engage in a scenario that teaches them empathy.
Amazing. Thank you very much for that, or those best practices for sure. And Lauran, you've been hearing the questions. You now know kind of the vibe of the podcast and what we're doing here, what we're all about. Did somebody come to your mind and say, well, I'd really like to listen to this or that person answering those questions, sort of a future guest for Professor Game?
Well, my colleague, Richard Goslin, who's also at Houston Community College, is an economics professor, and he's writing a book about game-based and gamification learning through economics and simulations and things like that. So I'd love to have him on the podcast.
Amazing. Sounds like a very interesting one as well. And talking about recommendations, is there, of course, aside from any of your books, any recommendation of a book that can bring inspiration to the engagers, again, directly on gamification or game-based learning, or, something that is on the side, so to speak, or something completely different?
I recommend the Medici Effect. It's kind of interesting. It's about, it's Franz Johansson is the author, but it's about innovation and harnessing a team and iteration and things like that. That it's not directly about game-based learning, but it is what inspired my escape room. So I do recommend that.
Amazing. I'll check out that book for sure. And within this space, teaching, game-based learning, gamification, what would you say is your superpower? That thing that you do at least better than most other people?
I think it's the ability to look at whether, any kind of lesson, again, whether it's with my students or with my clients, and say, I want to make this interesting and I want to make this fun and I want to make it valuable. Because a lot of people, like I said, they look at something and they think, oh, well, I can only teach biology or whatever it is this way that I've always known how to do it. So I think my ability / desire to try new things and make things fun is my superpower, because that's why I've created so many game-based things and why I continue to play around with gamification.
Amazing. Good stuff. And Lauran, we come to the difficult question now. What would you say is your favorite game?
Oh, no. So I've been thinking about this, and it's like, so hard. Right now, my family is really into Everdell, which is a board game. We have all the expansions. The box is ridiculously large. Like, it doesn't even fit in our game cabinet. We had to put it in a separate closet. And it is a really fun game. I'll brag about my daughter a little bit. It's a 14 and up game, but she's 10 and she's been playing it with us for a while. But it's the kind of game that takes 4 or 5 days to play. So this is where our custom game table is handy, because we just put the top on it and eat dinner and then take the top off and keep playing for days.
Sounds amazing. Thank you very much for that. So, Lauran, we're arriving to the end of the interview today. However, of course, we don't want to let you go before any final words you want to say. Where can we find out more about what you do, about that? Definitely that escape room as well would be very interesting. I don't know, any place you can lead us to, and then before we'll say game over.
Of course. Check me out at alteringcourse.com. I've got articles about the escape room there. I also have information about my gamified coaching programs, and all my socials are there as well. So that's alteringcourse.com.
Amazing. Any final words?
Well, thanks for having me on. I'm really excited to go play more games now.
Always excited to play more games. That sounds absolutely amazing. So, Lauran, Thank you very much for participating, for spreading your knowledge, your understanding, your experience in all these areas. However, as you know now, and engagers, as you very well know, at least for now and for today, it is time to say that it's game over. And I'm always curious, if you can answer to me at some point through email, through any other social media, it would be great. Because I'd like to know, how are you listening to this podcast? Are you using a podcasting app? Are you listening through our web? Are you using YouTube, Spotify? Like, where are you listening to us? And if it is through mobile, have you followed, have you rated this podcast? If you haven't, and even if you don't listen to it on your mobile apps, please download an app or use an app and do so. Follow, rate, review the podcast. Anything for us in that sense would be amazing, because that way we'll be able to reach more engagers like you and achieve that mission of making learning amazing. And if you want any instructions, any idea of how to do it, you can go to professorgame.com/iTunes. And of course, before you go on to your next mission, I can't help but remind you to subscribe or follow using your favorite podcast app and listen to that next episode of Professor Game. See you there.